Okay, so this is our third Open Democracy Book Club, and there's some repeat offenders and some new people, and it's really great to have people here to do this. So this started with books that kind of address the books that we're talking about and reading together. Kind of have three things going on. The question is, where are we? How do we get here? What do we do about it? And those have proven to be good sort of basic core questions. I see somebody saying, I can stay only for a while, but not for the breakout discussion. That's great. Come for what you can come for. And the first half hour, you'll be hearing Larry Lessig talk about things, about the book and what other, ideas that he wants to talk about from that. And in a minute, Olivia will introduce him. So again, just sort of that's what we're thinking about. Where are we? How do we get here? What are we doing about it? What do we want to do about it? If you have questions or problems with the Zoom mechanics, just let us know. There are little tricks, like there is a way to put up your hand. If you look at the bottom of your bar, there's a reactions tab, and you can, at the bottom of it, there's a raise hand function, or you can do a hand clap or a thumbs up if somebody says something absolutely brilliant that you love. It's a good idea to stay muted for this part, because otherwise your microphone is going to pick up background noise. But when we get into the breakout rooms, obviously don't be muted. And again, we're having people use the chat. Say hi, tell us your name, where you're from. Questions, questions that you have for Professor Lessig as he's talking, or for us. The chat is interactive. We will save the chat. We're recording the Zoom, so hopefully it's all smooth. As I say, we have the first half hour together, then we'll go into the breakout rooms, and then we'll come back. So, Olivia, I think I'll turn it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Olivia Zink, the Executive Director of Open Democracy. Our organization was founded by Granny D, and we work on fixing our campaign finance system, redistricting reform, and voting rights. And tonight I have a really distinct honor of introducing Professor Lessig, who is a Harvard law professor. He is an author. He is a thought leader. He is what I call a serial democracy entrepreneur, founding Root Strikers and Equal Citizen and lots of other organizations. And the very first time I introduced Professor Lessig at an Open Democracy function, he launched our program called the New Hampshire Rebellion, which we've now walked and logged almost 50,000 miles collectively for reform. And so I'm a little nervous to hand the program over to Larry to say, what are we going to do about it, Larry? But we stand behind you if you tell us to walk from the top of New Hampshire to the bottom of New Hampshire in the winter. We're ready, and we're ready for the biggest reform and the boldest democracy ideas, because our country needs it. Turn it over to you.
Olivia, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for showing up for a book club. What a great use of Zoom for a book club. I'm going to just talk briefly about what this book is trying to do. And I'm eager for questions that the book or anything might have triggered. But the objective of the book was really to talk about two kinds of problems. And the one is very familiar to anybody who's been involved in the democracy movement since Granny D. And that's the problem we could describe as how they, as in the government, don't represent us. And the nature of that problem is to recognize that in a republic, which our framers meant as a representative democracy, the core idea is that the system for selecting the government, and the government itself, is supposed to be representative. And the first part of the book shows how our representative democracy is clearly not representative. And it's not representative because of a number of institutional flaws that we've allowed to evolve within our system. And the one most familiar to people in this group is the one Granny D walked across the country about. And that's the corrupting influence of money inside of politics. The fact that members of Congress will spend 30 to 70% of their time raising money from a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1% means they have radically more power in our democracy than the rest of the ordinary Americans in our democracy. So that's one way in which our system is unrepresentative. But in addition to that, it's unrepresentative because of gerrymandering, where politicians draw districts to pick their voters rather than voters having the chance to pick their politicians. It's unrepresentative because of the techniques. And after 2020, there'll be many, many of these techniques to make it harder for some to vote than for others. And that is typically motivated by partisan interest. I know in New Hampshire, there's a fight about whether students are going to be able to vote. That's not accidental. And so that too are ways in which the institutions of our democracy deny an equal freedom to vote, which is to say it denies representativeness in the very selection of representatives. The Senate is another dynamic of this unrepresentativeness, and the Electoral College, which because of the choice by states, all but two, to allocate their electors in a winner-take-all manner, means that presidential candidates really just care about maybe 10, at most a dozen states, the so-called swing states, states that could go one way or another. Obviously, New Hampshire has traditionally been a swing state, but states like Kentucky or California or Massachusetts are not. And the reality is, when the presidential candidates spend all of their time focused on the swing states, they're building a program for a country that isn't America, because the swing states don't represent America. They're older, they're whiter, their industries are not quite the industries, the cutting edge industries of all of America. And so the point is, the system we have for selecting the president too makes our democracy unrepresentative. Okay, so you add up all of these ways in which our democracy is unrepresentative, and you have to step back and say, well, in what sense then are we a representative democracy? And my view is we are a radically imperfect representative democracy, and that imperfection must be addressed. Now, at the end, I'm going to talk about the hopefulness here, because I do think we're on the cusp of doing something that would radically improve that unrepresentativeness, but that's the unrepresentativeness of them. Okay, now that problem is hard. It's hard to imagine how we solve it. It takes a lot of work to figure out how to solve it. And we've had lots of debates about the ways in which different reforms would solve it. But when I wrote this book, I realized that problem is the easy problem. The harder problem is the other side of unrepresentativeness, not the unrepresentativeness of our government, but the unrepresentativeness of us. And the reason we're unrepresentative is we increasingly live in a media environment that kind of separates us out into different tribes. And the story that each tribe hears is different. So the world each tribe thinks they're living in is different. And so we have a democracy where we expect that when we ask the people what they believe, the people will, on the basis of knowing something, tell us what they believe or what we should do. But the reality is we've built a world, a media world, where we live in different worlds. As Barack Obama says, if you watch Fox News, you live in a different universe than if you read the New York Times. And the reason that's a critical problem is a democracy is supposed to be the mechanism for a nation to address the common problems we have. But if we don't even have a common understanding of those problems, how are we all going to address them together? And when I wrote this book, I thought this was a really significant problem, but obviously the 2020 election, or the post-2020 election, I think emphasizes that this is the most important problem. Because what the post-2020 election demonstrated is the extraordinary capacity of this media infrastructure to craft radically different understandings of the truth, right? So, you know, obviously in a state like New Hampshire, you've been exposed to both sides of this. We have it less in Massachusetts, but there are still both sides here in Massachusetts too. But, you know, it's astonishing just to step back and realize we've just had an election where the vast majority of Republicans, self-identified Republicans, believe Joe Biden stole the election. They believe that. It's not, you know, there's a bunch of people like Sean Hannity who doesn't believe that, just says he believes that. But the point is, these are people who believe it, and they believe it because, you know, for example, in the period between the election and January 6th, Fox News repeated 880 times that the election was stolen because of fraud, and there was a fight to steal it back, to stop the steal, to get it back. And that belief, you know, for many of these people manifested itself in an extraordinary event in American history where, you know, thousands of people showed up in Washington motivated by this belief, which is objectively absolutely false. And the president induced an insurrection on the basis of that belief. Now, you know, I look at what happened, and many people are outraged, and, you know, of course, the whole event is outrageous. But, you know, leading up to that election, there are many of us who were gaming out how the election could have been stolen the other way, because there was lots of talk about getting legislatures to reverse the vote of their people in the state, or getting Mike Pence to ignore the vote of some electors in the states and to select another slates of electors. And as we worked this out, you know, many of us were like, what should we do if we honestly believe the election has been stolen? What do we do if we think that people have illegally intervened in our election to steal the election? And if you honestly believe that, I'm not sure what the right thing to do is. I'm not sure it's obvious that, you know, raising some hell isn't the right thing to do. But the point isn't that, the point isn't whether they were right or not. The point is that we had this world where they believed that. And I think this should give us enormous pause. Because if we've entered an age where it's possible to craft a completely false belief that is believed by the majority of one of the two major parties, and no matter what anybody does, we can't sort of pull them back to reality, there's a real question of how we go forward. How do we build a nation, a democracy, where we can even understand each other or hear each other enough to address our common problems in a common and constructive way? So that's problem two. And that problem, I think, is enormously difficult. The book has some suggestions about how we get towards solving that problem, but I don't know that we yet know how that problem gets solved. Okay, but let's go back to the first one, the way they don't represent us. Because the reality is, it's astonishing to believe that we are on the cusp of Congress passing a law, H.R. 1, which is the most ambitious democracy reform package passed by the House of Representatives since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This bill would end the suppression of the votes in the states, suppression that is going to be manifested even more extremely by the 253 bills that are now being passed through the states to make it harder for some to vote, namely Democrats than Republicans. That's number one. Number two, it would end partisan gerrymandering in those states that still have partisan gerrymandering. Number three, it would create a way for Congress people to fund their campaigns without relying on large donors. You can run small dollar funded campaigns, so small contributions are matched 6-to-1, so you can afford to run for office without being beholden to the very rich. And number four, there's significant improvement in transparency, so we know exactly where the money is coming from. Now, in addition to those four fundamental changes, the law also adds an extraordinary range of ethics regulations. For the first time, the Supreme Court has ethics rules that applies to them. A whole bunch of Donald Trump ethics rules, like, for example, you must release your tax returns. A whole bunch of things that make extraordinary sense. But the point is, they're bundled together. The House has passed it. The Senate is committed to passing it if they can solve the problem of the filibuster. And the president has promised to sign it. Now, we've never been this close. And my view is, though this bill is not perfect, it would solve 80% of what is most importantly wrong with the current system that makes them unrepresentative and makes it possible for us to build a more representative democracy. So, if there's something to do, it's to do everything we can to make sure that law gets passed by solving the problem in the Senate to make it so we get past the filibuster. But the question I want to leave to you, and I'm happy to take other questions from you, but here's my question for you. And if you can solve this in your breakout groups, you can save democracy. You can save America. So here it is. This is your chance to save America. How do we solve this problem of this tribalized, separated America? How do we make it so that we can hear each other again? What do we do? How do we build it to protect ourselves from a media that profits from turning us into crazy partisans? Because if we don't figure out a way to inoculate ourselves from the effect of that media, whether it's cable news or Facebook, then we're not going to have a democracy to be fighting over, because we're going to have this world where we each have a view of the world that's inconsistent with the other tribe's view of the world, and no potential to engage in ordinary democratic deliberation about how to make the world a better, or at least America, a better place. So that's the challenge I would leave to you. I'm happy to, I want to stop now and take whatever questions we can in the time you're going to give me. But again, I'm grateful for you taking up this book. The paperback comes out in a week, and that has a summary of HR 1 in it, and it has reflections on the 2020 election, which I've given you my core thought right now. But Olivia, I'll take it however you want to go now.
We have a hand from Winston. We'll go with, and there's a few questions in the chat that we'll get to. You can unmute.
There. First of all, I enjoyed the book a lot. It overlaps with, I'm writing my second book right now, and it was of particular interest to me. To answer your second question, I think I'm a retired civics teacher with a deep appreciation for the ideals upon which our nation was founded. And I think that people on both sides of the aisle at the grassroots level have a big area in common, which is our belief in democracy, consent of the governed. And I think if you start by focusing on what we're united about, that the answers get easier. And For the People Act is certainly part of the answer. Ranked choice voting with multiple member districts is part of the answer. But in the course of researching and writing my book, I came up with another thing that could help a lot. And my idea was to simply give, how do the governed give their consent to the just powers of the government? And my answer was either by letting people write in any member of the House or Senate on a ranked choice ballot, and then giving members of Congress weighted votes based on how many people chose them directly as their representative. A more direct way to do that would be just to let everyone issue a proxy to the senator or representative who, to quote John Adams, thinks, feels, acts, and reasons as they do. And if I'm remembering right, you quoted part of that John Adams quote in your book. And then based on the number of proxies you have a weighted vote. If you combine that with doing away with the presidential veto, especially, the most powerful people in the country would be the senators and representatives who best represent the will of the people and therefore hold the most proxies and have the highest weighted vote. Between them, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders could have a controlling interest in the US Senate.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a brilliant innovation. And the challenge for it is we live in a democracy where we can't get anything changed. I mean, the Constitution is extraordinarily difficult to amend. I know your first event was focused on Citizens United because you were around Citizens United. The idea of amending the Constitution has animated the work of many good souls, but it's so difficult to imagine how it happens. But one way to think about the predicament we're in is, in my view, HR 1 would secure majoritarian government in America. And if we don't get it, we're going to have minoritarian government. It was like Syria or Iraq, because the vote suppression techniques that are in the 253 bills being considered around the states would make it so that effectively the Republicans can win, even though they don't get more votes. And the same thing with redistricting. The redistricting will make it so that just on the basis of the redistricting, they can win control of the House, even though they have fewer votes. Now, it's not that I have anything against the Republicans. Indeed, walking in New Hampshire, I met a lot that were, as you say, Winston, united in the view about what democracy should be. But I do believe that the party in Washington has become so obsessed with blocking democratic reform. And HR 1 would get us that. But to get HR 1, right now, we've got to get 60 votes in the Senate. So we need a supermajority to secure the power of majoritarian democracy, which is to say, maybe we already have a minoritarian democracy.
I think you hit on the key thing there, that the essence of democracy, and John Locke makes a much better case for this than was made in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, but it is majority rule.
Should be.
I mean, that's the heart and soul. If the people rule, how do they rule? They rule by voting, and what determines the outcome? The votes of the majority. And if we can agree on that, then we can agree to fix it. And hopefully between now and November of 2022, we can agree that any member of the House or Senate or any state legislature that doesn't agree with majority rule is voted out.
No, we should get there. That should be at least a common ground.
There's a lot of talk that the election in 2020 was a referendum on democracy. I don't believe it was. I think it was a referendum on Donald Trump, but I believe we need a referendum on democracy,
I would like
and
that.
the sooner the better.
Great.
Thank you so much for doing this.
What?
Susan Richmond.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for being here. You have so many wonderful ideas in the last third of the book, but I'm wondering what is realistically doable in what amount of time versus what would have the greatest effectiveness. So how would you prioritize? What comes first?
I think, obviously HR 1 is the most important thing. There's nothing that comes close to that. We have to get HR 1 passed. And that, I think, if we get that passed, then there's another round of tinkering with reform we should talk about. I agree that, ranked choice voting with multi-member districts would be better than the gerrymandering reform. And I think we should get vouchers as a core part of public funding. But, those are quibbles against this basic reform. The harder question is, what can we do to knit together a nation again? And that's really hard. I can tell you we're launching, and we're going to invite Open Democracy to be one of the leading participants in this. We're launching a project called deliberations.us. And what deliberations will do is the first subject will be the Electoral College. And we've got a series, like 3 videos, very short videos, like no more than 6 minutes each, that kind of introduce issues around the Electoral College. And you go to this virtual platform, AI-driven moderator, and you get to deliberate with groups of people about this issue. And the idea is to have different people that you don't necessarily agree with. And over the course of an hour, you would have covered the full range of issues about the Electoral College. And we take a poll at the beginning and the poll at the end, and we see whether people can converge on their views. We think we can get 1 million people to go through this process by, and we're going to go to the schools and to the universities, but over the next 2 years, we want to get 1 million people to have deliberated like this. And my view is, when people have an experience of deliberating with people they don't agree with, in a context where they have to be civil and listen, that changes you. That changes us. It makes us into better citizens. Now, that alone won't solve the problem of America's democracy, but my point is that's the kind of change that I was pointing to in the last third of the book. Because what that's doing is trying to make us better democratic citizens. Rather than being responsive to whatever tweet or whatever Facebook news feed or Sean Hannity or something on MSNBC getting us riled up because it profits them, it helps us think more deliberatively and reflectively and seriously about these issues. And I think we need to see, an extraordinary number of experiments like that to bring people in. This very event, book clubs, is a perfect example of that, because the consequence of thinking seriously about these issues like this is to turn us into better citizens. And that's what we need to become. We need to be better citizens by doing a different kind of democracy if we're ever going to get past the temptation of this really awful media environment that we find ourselves in.
If I'm allowed a follow-up, we're all like-minded, so that's why we're all here. Would you conscript people to join these conversations or pay them to join them? How would you ensure that you get the full array of opinion?
Great. It's a very serious part of the challenge. So we're gonna run it through some organizations to kind of test the kick the tires to make sure the system is working right. And then we're going to go into institutions which have by their nature people of different views. So like schools or universities, they'll have a mix. And you'll be assigned in your class that you need to do this, and so won't be just all democracy reformers. And eventually, yes, we want to be in a position where we, are offering real compensation for people to participate and begin to have, every small group have at least a diversity inside it. That's going to be the objective. But, we're just beginning. We'll see how far we can get.
Thank you.
Jeff Tickler?
Hi. I had a question that I sent on to Kate Kuhn, and I believe she forwarded it to Professor Lessig. So it's a little bit off the rails, but when I was reading your book, I was really looking for this, how to address this. And it seemed, how can you defend falsehood in political advertising? If a retail company were to tout their products with the level of lies and misinformation that politicians seem to commonly apply, they would be fined by the FTC and the consumer protection organizations. If the social media organizations continue in their failure to remove false information from their sites, why cannot they be held liable? More people now get their news in social media than any official news source.
Yeah.
If they're going to allow posting of news articles, why can't they be held to the same standards as the newspaper?
Yeah, so the short answer is the Supreme Court's interpretation of the First Amendment. That makes it extremely hard for laws to target false information in the air. Now, you're right, the FTC in its regulation of commerce can address fraudulent transactions or fraudulent advertising around commerce. But when you're talking about political speech, the court has been extremely vigorous in imposing very strict burdens in limiting the ability to punish false speech. False speech that's defamatory, that actually hurts somebody's reputation, you can address so long as the publisher has been reckless or knew that it was false. But if it doesn't affect somebody's reputation, the Supreme Court has hinted that there's just no constitutional power to attack falsity in the air. And I think it's a real problem when the incentive of platforms like Facebook and CNN or cable television is to rile us up rather than to tell us the truth. Olivia, are you going to call on someone, or should you want me to?
All right, we'll go to Ken.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Larry, for being here, and good to see you again. You were very helpful to us here in Wyoming a few years ago when we were doing a petition drive. I'm part of Wyoming Promise, and we were trying to get an initiative on the ballot here in Wyoming to endorse overturning Citizens United, and you spoke to our group and were very, very helpful, and we appreciate all your help, and I love your book. My comment and my question relates to that experience that we had a few years ago when we were doing the petition drive. We would every so often go out to public events with a table to try and get people to sign our petition. We had a big banner in front to announce what we're doing, and there was the banner said something about reclaiming our democracy, blah, blah, blah. And a very common response we got from the conservative members of our citizens here in Wyoming was that, oh, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic.
Yep.
A very common response. And my pat answer was always, well, don't you want to vote for who represents you in this republic? And that sometimes led to interesting conversations, but I never understood how different they had, the different point of view that we saw here until recently, actually January 6th, when I realized that there are people who really don't respect democracy anymore, and they're okay with authoritarian leaders and having somebody else make all the decisions and do all the work. And that is the problem that you say that we need to fix us. We live in different worlds, and I'm having a hard time still trying to figure out how to break through to those who think the republic means somebody else governs us and we're going to be subjects to this authoritarian rule. How do we break through that? I'm at a loss.
It's a great question, and I'm going to post in the chat a link to a Medium page I wrote to respond to this exactly. Because in some sense, this book, the first part of this book was written in response to that view, right? So yes, our framers gave us a republic, but by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. That's what a republic meant. And so the point about the book is to say, okay, if it's a representative democracy, then it needs to be, it's kind of in the title, right? It needs to be representative. So we all should be able to agree that we need a representative democracy, whether you believe the republic language or you believe the democracy language. And, so you want to say, is a representative democracy a democracy? Well, you tell me, is a Ford truck a truck? Seems to me it's a democracy, just a particular kind of democracy. The framers certainly were against direct democracy, and they believed representatives were an essential part, and I do too. But they certainly believed in majoritarian representative democracy, and we all should be able to agree on that and fight for that. And what we see right now is efforts, in the states to defeat that idea, to make it so, the most extraordinary of these bills that would make it so that a state legislature, if it doesn't like how the people have voted in the presidential election, can reverse the vote, pick a slate of electors according to their own judgment. Now, when you've got a state legislature that's been picked through a gerrymandered system, so it doesn't even represent the people, which has the power to overturn the vote of the people in the presidency, then you've gone off the rails. We no longer have a representative democracy at all. And so that's why what I'm trying to do is to say, look, we should be able to agree on at least this. We have a representative democracy. Call it a republic if you want, but that's what they meant. And so let's at least make it representative. And if it's representative, then we have to fight about how we're going to get common understanding about the problems they should address.
Okay, so there's lots more questions, and I know we want to move into breakout rooms. So I want to take a couple more, and I feel like some of you chatted your questions. So James, who's raising his hand, wrote in the chat around the filibuster. What do we do about the filibuster? Jim, who has his hand up, also sent a message in the chat about media companies and civic responsibilities and civic technology to empower voters, and how what do we think about reforming the media through direct voter participation and reforming the political process? So I'm gonna have Larry take those two questions.
Okay. I mean, I know you've got a schedule, and I don't want to interfere with it, but I'm happy to take questions for as long as you want, Olivia.
Okay.
But let's take those two. So the filibuster. The important thing to realize about the filibuster is that the current norm is radically different from the historical norm about the filibuster. Like, the filibuster was created in the Senate by accident. They removed the rule that allowed them to end debate. But then they began to allow it as an exceptional case. When there's something that you really cared about, then you could stand on the floor and you could make your case heard, and debate would not be stopped. And, you know, all the way through the middle part of the last century, like, you know, Strom Thurmond had to stand on the floor for more than 24 hours to slow the consideration of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. But the rule has been modified so that you don't need to do anything. You don't need to stand up and debate at all. You just have to send a note to the majority leader that you will object, and the majority leader's rules now say they will not allow a vote to occur unless you can get 60 votes to call for it. So it has nothing to do with deliberation anymore. And more importantly, it's not exceptions, it's everything. Like, you know, Mitch McConnell started this when they became the majority leader, when he became the majority leader first under Obama. And the very first issue that came up, I think it was like naming some post office or something like this. They refused to allow it to go forward because they wanted to demonstrate that they had the power to stop anything they wanted to stop. So anybody who defends the filibuster, the first question you should ask them is, what are you talking about? What filibuster? You want to defend the idea that people should be allowed to debate as long as they want? Fine. Force them to debate. Force them to show up and say, give arguments. And as long as they want to talk, let them talk. But the idea that you automatically get to stop legislation unless you can get 60 votes, you know, 60 votes in the Senate means that 12% of the American public could be represented by senators who are blocking the ability of the Senate to consider something. 12%. There's no justification for that at all. With respect to the media company, that's a really complicated question. But here's the core part of it. You know, the problem we have is that the business model of media companies is against us. You know, it's like the business model of fast food companies. Like, they're just trying to make money. They're not trying to make us sick. But it turns out the best way to make money in a fast food company is to give us terrible food that's addictive and bad for us. You know, that's just the way it is. Too bad for us. But, you know, the idea that you're going to talk fast food companies into, you know, serving us carrots, this is not going to happen. It's us who have to choose to eat the carrots rather than the buffalo wings. We've got to exercise that kind of discipline. So that's why, again, something like this event is the remedy to the reality that democratic speech in our country today is captured by people who have an economic incentive to make us crazy. And we have to resist it. We have to, you know, we have to be as careful about our mind, the information we put in our head, as we are about the food we eat, and realize, you know, companies that are providing it on both sides don't have our best interest at heart.
Janet? Oh, you're muted.
Thank you very much for taking my question, Professor Lessig. I'm going to bounce back to your deep concern about the American public, the American voters' challenge to find information they can rely on. And you noted that the Supreme Court is loath to touch our freedom of political speech. But I can't help but think about the fact that if I exercise my right to say anything I want to and I yell fire in a crowded theater, I can get arrested. And on January 6th, those people were there because fire was being yelled coast to coast through the media. The election was stolen. You noted that on Fox News, it was 80 plus times that lie was repeated. So, and in our state, where the Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, the governor, all talk about how basically honest and absolutely reliable our election here in New Hampshire were. Nonetheless, we have Republicans spinning out all kinds of ridiculous voter suppression laws. So my question is, legally speaking, the posturing of the Supreme Court to protect our political speech, you mean to say legal minds cannot attack that and get somewhere?
Well, so what I mean to say is, it's an impossibly difficult strategy. So you're right. On January 6th, what was being said at the moments before that riot, that insurrection, was not protected speech. I mean, it would. The First Amendment would not stop prosecutions on the basis of that, and I think we're going to see prosecutions on what happened on January 6th, because the threat was imminent. And that's the standard the Supreme Court has evolved. If the threat is imminent, that's the yelling fire in a crowded theater. Those words will create an imminent danger, and that's why they can be regulated. But the words Fox News uttered every single day between the election and January 6th, nothing was imminent about that. I'm just telling you, this is the way the Supreme Court would look at it. So between two strategies, I'm saying there are two possible strategies. One strategy is trying to imagine the Supreme Court changing its mind and saying political speech is not going to be protected in the ways that for the last 50 years, it has been building a jurisprudence to protect. And the other is the strategy of just trying to find a way to make it so that those lies don't have the effect that they have. And that's harder for us because it requires us to do something, right? So, you know, I think there's a really important conversation we've got to begin to have, like with our neighbors. And it's not a conversation of saying, how can you be so idiotic as to believe that the election was stolen? It's more of a conversation of, just help me understand, how could you believe that? Like, what is it that could help you to bring you to believe that? So, like, to bring us back to human communication as the cure, or it's not a cure, as the only resistance that we're going to have right now. I can tell you, you know, I see easy cases here. I also see hard cases. You know, the president, when you look at the Washington Post calculation of how many times the president lied, even then they will say, here's a clear lie, here's an arguable lie, you know, and so, you know, how far down that line are we going to have legal prosecution? And then the final point here is, what would the consequence of that prosecution be, right? So, you know, when Facebook and Twitter started adding tags on the president's tweets and posts that says this is false or this is contested, the assumption was that was going to help people understand that what he was saying was not true. The reality was many people looked at that warning and said, oh, this shows he is saying true things, and, you know, the media conspiracy is just trying to silence him. So I wonder, you know, if we start having prosecutions in courts against politicians because they, quote, lie, is that going to rile up the other side, or is that going to calm the other side? And I think it's as likely to rile them up as it is to calm them. But all of that assumes something which you can't assume away, which is that the First Amendment will not stand there as a strict bulwark against prosecutions of political speech.
Great, and I thank you for hanging in there. I know you've got some family things, and there's lots of questions in the debate, but we will also have lovely discussions amongst ourselves about the book as we break into breakout groups. And you've inspired me. I have a next door neighbor who's got their big Trump banner and believes that the elections were stolen. And I will try to have a conversation with Michelle. You know, it's not always easy to have those conversations with our neighbors, but it's important work that we must do. So I'm going to break
Really
out.
hard and really important.
I want to thank you so much, Professor Lessig, for being with us today. And we'll break out into breakout rooms. You'll be in your room for 30 minutes, and then we'll have a very quick debrief at the end of the night.
Okay, thanks very much.
Support so that their local messages should be broadcast more widely to others. That would go a long way, and it's one of the few near-term things that could happen. Most of the others are much harder, but it doesn't go very far.
And Clifford for room 3?
Yes, I also want to thank Bob, Jennifer, George, Ken, and Brian for moderating. We all really got along well and shared some nice opinions. We pretty much touched on a bunch of the stuff that has been talked about from the other breakout rooms, but we sort of settled on the fact that both parties seem to want to remain in power. And we connected power to more than just money, but like getting money out of politics. But we connect money out of politics to an economic system that failed the majority of people in the US. And we seem to settle on the idea that maybe we need to make some major tweaks to capitalism, change the taxation system in such a way, the way it was back in the 50s, corporations were taxed much higher, look for ways of being equitable and fair for our society, and not being afraid to talk about how intelligent cultural societies move forward into more equitable economic systems like a socialistic oriented system. So George seemed to feel that, you can't convince people to change their minds, and we just have to move through legislation as much as we can. But ultimately, we settled on the feeling that we can't get money out of politics when it's in an economic system that is no longer functioning for the majority. So we got to tackle both money out of politics and make our economic system more equitable and fairer. That's pretty much it.
And any specific actions that your group?
Yes, I brought up an action. Ken mentioned, well, how can we do this? I said we have to start talking about socialism in very positive ways and deal with, the taxation system as part of that. And we can't be afraid to talk about socialism in very positive ways, because that's the only way you can't equalize, but make societies fairer for everybody. Just not being afraid to talk about having socialistic system. I don't know any other way. I mean, we can go to bat in legislatures locally and nationally, but we're still banging our head against two systems right now, Democrats and Republicans, that both are looking for one thing only: power. How can you get rid of the power? Change the economic system and take money out of it.
One more group, or did we get all the groups, Olivia?
No,
or is there one more?
Group 4. Maybe David or Bev or Liz from group 4. Or I don't know if group 4 had a reporter. Maybe I can pick on David Andrews.
With
Yeah,
yeah, David.
yeah, we had a great discussion over a lot of different topics, including ranked choice voting, Winston's idea of having a proxy in Congress, which is very interesting. And we didn't come out of it with anything per se to do, but just more talking about ideas and that kind of thing.
Actually, one thing that we did talk about is Jim Ragsdale. We were talking about media and irresponsible media, kind of continuing that conversation. And Jim has started up a new kind of, I'll call it a new format, I guess, might not be quite the right word, mainstreamnation.com. So check that out. It sounds like a very interesting idea. And Liz Tantarelli also explained that starting communications and accountability for our representatives as a grassroots starting local, and talked about listening sessions. They have one Republican and one Democratic state rep, and they do listening sessions. And they started them themselves, but Liz has been trying to replicate that in other towns. And that sounds also like it speaks a little bit to Professor's comment about tribalized America. And that starts at a very low level to try to open maybe channels of communication, even though you're not always agreeing with each other. So that was a couple potential takeaways.
Great. Any other actions from any of the other groups? You can put them in the chat or shout them out quickly what you're going to do. Okay, so the next book club, oh, go ahead.
Just our group had the idea of maybe when we write our senators of saying that we're in favor of a talking filibuster. So as opposed to saying no filibuster ever, you know, that allows us to move forward, to be a little bit more flexible and, you know, yeah, let's hear those ideas.
That's a great action. Call your senator on S1 and advocate for those reforms.
May I make one quick point before we go?
Yes.
With regard to the lack of bipartisanship and the partisanship that was discussed, or things being framed as socialist or capitalist, one way to look at that and argue is that Congress is elected to be our representatives to basically, in the declaration of our Constitution or the preamble, to serve the best interests in a deliberative way, you know, for all our public interests. And you can break through socialism or capitalism by focusing on, you know, what is actually going to serve the bulk of all US citizens the fairest and the best. And if you approached healthcare that way, if you approached like S1, HR1 was termed a partisan bill. There's nothing in it that should be partisan because it's speaking to what serves all Americans in an equal way. It gets back to Larry Lessig's equal citizens theme. And I just wanted to put that on the table.
So maybe give me a little bit of a last word with that. Something that Larry talked about, and I actually had the page number. It's like he gives the pizza example. Instead of saying, well, what do I want? I want my pizza right now, even though you can't eat gluten. What do we do as a family? You know, so how do we think not just individual self-interest? And it's when he's talking about greenback tweedism, if you remember his the tweeds, and then all what you're talking about is the money, the greenback thing. As he said, so not what can I get, it's what does America want? And he gives a bunch of examples towards the end. So that's a good way to do it. The other go-to thing I think is make sure you're not trying to do this by yourself. Find the groups, find the leagues of women voters, Find the Open Democracy, the Common Causes, the American Promises, the other things. Everything is by Zoom. So you're going to amplify and you won't feel like you're just spinning your wheels. So just find links to other organizations if you don't have it right where you are, and come back in 6 weeks to the politics of joy and sacrifice. Olivia says it's full of joy and will really energize us. So
So
What's the next?
book
here's
is
Brian's holding it up, and we'll give you lots of information about how to get it. So pay attention to our, oh, look at that. It's skinny. And Brian's giving us the three-dimensional view.
This is a collection of 40 speeches by Doris Haddock that Dennis Burke helps pull together. Dennis Burke, the author, will join us for the first 30 minutes of the politics of joy and sacrifice. But it's a lot of wisdom from our founder, Granny D, in that book. And you can order the book by going to opendemocracynh.org, and we'll mail you a copy of it, or you can get it online as well and have it mailed to you.
I think we're offering it for cheaper, right, Olivia?
We are offering it
Yeah.
cheaper than Amazon. So if you want to come to our website, you'll save a little bit of money. And Brian, will you throw the link in for the chat? And also I put a link in for an evaluation, which will also go out to an email. We'd love to know what you thought of tonight's program and what we could do better in our future book club and suggested book club titles. So please make sure to give feedback in the evaluation. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Fantastic group. Thank you.